On April 12, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died at Warm Springs, Georgia. He was sitting for a portrait. He complained of a headache. He was dead within hours. He was 63 years old and had been President of the United States for 12 years, longer than any man before him or since. Eleanor Roosevelt was in Washington when she received the news. She was brought to Warm Springs, and it was there, sometime during the hours that followed, that she learned something she had not known. Lucy Mercer Rutherfurd had been with her husband when he died. Lucy, the woman Eleanor had discovered her husband's affair with in 1918, the discovery that had come close to ending their marriage and that had, by most accounts, permanently altered the relationship between them, had been present in the room where Franklin Roosevelt died. Eleanor also learned who had arranged it: her daughter, Anna. This is that story. Chapter 1. Eleanor and Franklin. Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt were married in March 1905 when Eleanor was 20 and Franklin was 23. They were distant cousins. Eleanor's uncle, President Theodore Roosevelt, gave her away at the ceremony. The marriage was, by the standards of their social class and era, expected. A consolidation of two prominent families, a practical arrangement that also happened to involve genuine affection, at least at its outset. Eleanor was not, by the conventional measurements of her time and class, a confident young woman. She had been orphaned at 10, raised by a grandmother who loved her without particularly enjoying her company, educated in England at a school that was, for her, the first place she had felt genuinely at home. She was serious, intelligent, and profoundly uncertain about whether she was the kind of person other people would find worth knowing. She had been told repeatedly, and by people close to her, that she was not particularly attractive. She had absorbed this judgment. Franklin was different. He was handsome, effortlessly charming, capable of making anyone he was speaking with feel like the most important person in the room. He had been raised by a devoted mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, who had organized her entire adult life around his comfort and advancement. He had never, in any meaningful way, been disappointed. He assumed that things would go well for him, and they did, with a consistency that might have produced arrogance in a smaller man, but in Franklin produced something that looked like confidence and functioned as charisma. They built a life that was, from the outside, recognizable as happy. 6 children, of whom 5 survived infancy. A political career that moved from the New York State Senate to the position of Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson. A social life appropriate to their circumstances. And Eleanor, over the years, found her footing, became more confident, more direct, more willing to have and express views of her own. The woman she would become, the figure history has preserved as one of the great moral presences of the 20th century, was not yet visible. But the material was there. Chapter 2. Lucy Mercer. Lucy Page. Mercer was 22 years old when Eleanor hired her as a social secretary in 1914. She was from a good family that had fallen on difficult times. Her father had dissipated a fortune, and she had been working for several years to support herself. She was, by every account, strikingly beautiful, warm, at ease with people in a way that Eleanor, despite her growth, was never entirely comfortable being. She fit naturally into the world that the Roosevelts inhabited. She began working for Eleanor. She organized correspondence. She handled the social calendar. She was in the way of household employees in that class at that time, present at dinners, at gatherings, at the various occasions that constituted the Roosevelts' social life. Franklin was at home during this period. He found Lucy easy to talk to. She found him, apparently, compelling. The affair began sometime around 1916. The precise timeline has been a matter of historical debate for decades, because the primary sources, letters, diary entries, were not all preserved, and some of what was preserved was deliberately destroyed. What is not debated is that by the summer of 1918, something was happening. Eleanor found evidence that autumn. She had been unpacking Franklin's luggage, returned from a trip, and found the letters. She confronted him. He did not deny it. Eleanor offered him a divorce. His mother, Sarah, made clear that she would cut him off financially if he divorced Eleanor to marry Lucy, and Sarah controlled the money. Louis Howe, Franklin's political advisor, made clear that a divorce would end any political future. Lucy Mercer, who was Catholic, later indicated that she would not have married a divorced man. The affair was ended. Franklin promised it was over. Eleanor accepted the promise. She did not believe it entirely. The marriage continued. It continued for 27 more years, through the governorship of New York, through 4 terms as president, through the Second World War. It continued, but it was different. Eleanor herself said later that something had died in her after 1918. The marriage became, in the terminology she used, a partnership. It was an extraordinary partnership. She became, in many respects, a political force in her own right, advocating for causes he was unwilling to champion publicly, serving as a conduit for perspectives that would not otherwise have reached a president. But it was not, in the intimate sense, the marriage it had been. Chapter 3. Anna. Anna Eleanor Roosevelt was born in 1906, the first child and only daughter of Franklin and Eleanor. She grew up in a household that was, despite its external accomplishments, internally complicated. Her grandmother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, was a powerful presence who sometimes competed directly with Eleanor for authority over the children. Her parents were often absent, first by the demands of political life, then by the demands of the presidency. She was, like many children of prominent people, raised partly by the furniture of the institution her parents inhabited. She married 3 times. The first marriage, to a stockbroker named Curtis Dahl, produced 2 children and ended in divorce in 1934. The second, to the publisher John Boetiger, was happier. He worked as a newspaper editor in Seattle, and for several years Anna lived a life that was relatively removed from the center of her parents' world. Then the war changed things. John Boetiger enlisted. Anna, with her children, moved to Washington. In 1943, she began working in the White House. Her father was 61 years old and in declining health. His blood pressure was dangerously elevated. He suffered from arteriosclerosis. The physicians who examined him knew, and he knew, and kept from Eleanor and from the public, that his health was significantly worse than the official accounts suggested. He needed someone around him who was personally devoted to him and who could manage the practical details of his daily life without adding the weight of moral expectation. Eleanor was not that person. Eleanor's relationship with Franklin, by the 1940s, was conducted largely through correspondence and official occasion. She loved him. She served with him. But she made demands on him. Ethical demands. Political demands. The kind of sustained moral pressure that the people closest to great men often apply. She was not a comfortable presence. She was an important one. Anna was comfortable. She laughed at his jokes. She arranged his meals. She understood that her role was to make his daily existence easier, not to improve him. She became, in effect, his companion in the White House, sitting in on meetings, accompanying him to functions, present in the ways that Eleanor was often not. Chapter 4. The Return of Lucy. The affair had ended, formally, in 1918. Lucy Mercer had married in 1920, a wealthy widower named Winthrop Rutherfurd, who was nearly 30 years her senior. She became Lucy Mercer Rutherfurd, the mistress of several estates, the mother, by adoption, of Rutherford's children from his first marriage. She moved in the upper reaches of American society. which she did with the ease that had always characterized her. She was, by all accounts, a devoted presence in the Rutherfurd household. Winthrop Rutherfurd suffered a stroke in 1941. He was partially incapacitated. He died in March 1944. Lucy was a widow. She was in her early 50s. Franklin Roosevelt was President of the United States in his 4th term, fighting a world war, and in deteriorating health. The contact between them had not, in fact, entirely ceased during the years of the marriage. There had been meetings, careful, occasional, managed through intermediaries. Franklin had maintained communication that Eleanor did not know about. The affair, in its original form, had ended. Something else, something harder to characterize precisely, had not. Beginning in 1943, and with increasing frequency in 1944 and 1945, Lucy came to Washington. She came to the White House. She attended dinners. She was driven to Shangri-La, the presidential retreat in Maryland. She sat with Franklin in the evenings. The arrangements for these visits were made through channels that circumvented Eleanor, who was often traveling in her own right and who, when she was present in Washington, was frequently occupied with her own substantial schedule. The arrangements were made, in significant part, by Anna. Chapter 5. What Anna knew. Anna has been asked, in the years that followed, why she did it. Her answers, given in interviews conducted after both her parents had died, have the quality of someone who has thought carefully about the question and arrived at answers that are honest without being entirely complete. She did it, she said, because her father asked her to. He was the president. He was her father. He was ill. He was lonely. And he asked her, not always explicitly, but in the manner that powerful men ask for things, which is to say by making clear what they wanted and leaving the formal request unspoken, to help manage the situation. She did it because she could see, in the way that someone living in close proximity to a person in decline can see, that Lucy's presence made her father happy. The word she used in more than one interview was lit up. He lit up when Lucy was there. He did not, in the same way, light up when Eleanor was there. Eleanor made demands. Lucy made him feel, at 63 and seriously ill and carrying the weight of a world war, that he was still the man he had been. She did it also because she understood that Eleanor would be devastated. And she made the calculation that her father's remaining happiness, however much time was left, was worth the damage to her mother. It was a calculation she came to regret. Not because she thought it was wrong, exactly, but because of what it cost. What it cost was Eleanor. When Eleanor learned, in the hours after Franklin's death, that Lucy had been present at Warm Springs, and then learned that Anna had arranged it, the relationship between mother and daughter entered a period of sustained damage that required years to repair. Eleanor was not a woman who expressed anger easily. She expressed it to Anna. For a long time, in the cold and measured way that is harder to recover from than ordinary fury, Eleanor made clear that she felt betrayed. Chapter 6. Warm Springs. Franklin Roosevelt had been coming to Warm Springs, Georgia, since 1924. He had discovered the therapeutic warm mineral pools after contracting polio in 1921. And while the waters did not, despite his hopes, restore the use of his legs, they provided relief. He built a small cottage there, called the Little White House. He came several times a year when the presidency permitted. The town had grown around his presence. The locals called him Franklin. He liked that. In late March 1945, he came to Warm Springs to rest before the founding conference of the United Nations, scheduled for late April in San Francisco. He was visibly exhausted. The Yalta Conference, which he had attended in February, had taxed him severely. His aides and physicians had watched him with concern for months. Lucy Rutherfurd came to Warm Springs with him. She had brought with her a portrait artist, Elizabeth Shumatoff, who was to paint a formal portrait of the president. The presence of a portrait artist gave the visit an official character that made it easier to explain. On the morning of April 12th, Roosevelt was sitting in a chair in the cottage's living room, posing for the portrait. He was signing documents. He was talking. At approximately 1 p.m, he raised his hand to his head and said, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head." He lost consciousness. He never regained it. He was declared dead at 3:35 in the afternoon. Lucy Rutherfurd and Elizabeth Shumatoff left Warm Springs before Eleanor arrived. Lucy removed the unfinished portrait. She did not want Eleanor to find it there. Chapter 7. The Discovery. Eleanor arrived at Warm Springs in the evening. She was composed in the way that people who have absorbed a shock not yet fully felt are composed. She asked questions. She received answers. And at some point in the course of that evening, she learned what she had not known. The biographers who have written most carefully about this period, and there are many, because Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt have been the subject of more biographical attention than almost any American couple of the 20th century, differ in the precise sequence. What they agree on is the substance. Eleanor learned that Lucy had been present. She learned from the accounts of those who had been at Warm Springs that Lucy had been a frequent presence in Franklin's life during the preceding years. She learned, eventually, that Anna had helped facilitate the arrangements. Eleanor did not collapse. Eleanor was not the collapsing kind. She performed what needed to be performed. The widow of the President of the United States, which was a role that had duties and a public dimension. She performed it with the competence she had always brought to performance. And inside that performance, she held what she had learned. She wrote about it later. Not comprehensively. Eleanor's relationship with her own inner life, in print, was characteristically controlled. But she wrote enough that people who have studied her closely understand that the discovery at Warm Springs reactivated something that had not, despite the years and the partnership and the achievements, ever entirely healed. The 1918 discovery had not destroyed her. The Warm Springs discovery reminded her that it had not precisely been put to rest. Chapter 8. Anna. Anna Roosevelt spent years trying to recover her relationship with her mother. The process was difficult. Eleanor could be, when she chose to be, as cold as she was warm, and what Anna had done. The specific nature of the deception. The fact that it had continued over a period of years. The fact that Anna had looked at her mother and said nothing was not something Eleanor moved past quickly. They were reconciled. By the time Eleanor died in 1962, 17 years after Warm Springs, the relationship had been repaired to a functional state. Whether it was ever what it had been before is a question that Anna's subsequent accounts, given with care, do not quite answer. Anna gave her most extended account of the arrangement in a series of interviews conducted in the 1960s and 1970s. She described the position she had been in with the measured honesty of someone who had decided to tell the truth without asking for absolution. She said she had done what her father needed. She said she would probably do it again. She said the hardest thing was not what happened with her mother, but the years of carrying it alone before it became known. The years of being the person who knew something that the most important person in her life did not know, and had been asked specifically not to tell her. She died in 1975. She had outlived both her parents, both of whom had asked her, in different ways, for different things, to carry weights that were not ordinarily given to children. Chapter 9. What history does with this. Franklin Roosevelt is, in the standard accounts, one of the great presidents. He is credited with leading the country through the Depression, with designing the New Deal, with managing the United States through the Second World War to the point where Allied victory was clearly in prospect. His physical disability, the polio that left him unable to walk without assistance from 1921, has been reframed in historical writing as a source of the empathy that made him an effective leader during a period of profound national suffering. He died in office. He died, it now seems clear, in the company of the woman he had loved for 30 years. Eleanor Roosevelt is also, in the standard accounts, great. She is credited with transforming the role of First Lady, with advocating for the poor and the marginalized and the excluded at a time when doing so required real courage, with becoming, after Franklin's death, a major political figure in her own right, the architect of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a significant voice in the early United Nations, a moral authority to whom presidents and activists and ordinary people turned for guidance until her death in 1962. The standard accounts do not often examine what it cost her to be married, for 40 years, to a man who loved someone else. They note the 1918 discovery. They note the transformation of the marriage into a partnership. They move on, because the partnership was genuinely extraordinary, and because Eleanor herself seemed to believe, or to have concluded, that what she and Franklin built together was worth what it cost her. What she did not know, for most of that time, was that the cost included her daughter. The person she had raised. The person she thought she could trust. The person who had, for years, sat across from her at dinners and said nothing about what she had arranged. What families carry when the public story is magnificent. This is a question that the Roosevelt case does not resolve. It holds it open. Anna held it. Eleanor bore it. And Franklin, who died in a chair with a headache, took most of what was actually true with him, as people usually do